Hello board games and sisters, I'm Adam Singer and welcome to another episode where I'll be letting you know of all the board games launching on Kickstarter and GameFound over the next week. If you're new to the channel, we do this every week going over all the upcoming campaigns, so if you want to stay up to date, this is definitely the place to be. But before we get started, I do like to go over some new announcements and discoveries I just found out about, but I actually don't have too much to go over that I haven't already talked about, so I'll just give you a quick update of some of the campaigns to come and just what we can expect in the coming weeks, because we do have another bit of a slower week this week. It's not crazy slow, we still got a lot of games to go over, but there are going to be quite a bit of games in the next week and then the following week after that, because I already have 16 games for next week and 16 games for the following week, and these numbers are only going to be increasing. So I do expect October to be another huge month, and if you want to get a bit of a head start and checking out some of those games before I talk about them, you'll definitely want to go over and check out Alex at Board Game Co, because Alex and I do keep each other up to date with all the games that we know about so that I can provide you the best coverage in these videos, and then he can also let you know of all the games that we know about to come over each of the following months, because at the start of each month Alex puts out a video going over all those games. He also provides a ton of other content as well, and it's all super valuable. I'm a content creator and I stay up to date with a lot of these games, and I play a lot of these games and I dive into the details, and I still watch well, not all, but I watch a lot of his videos. And if there's any games in these videos that you're interested in, you can almost guarantee that Alex is going to be providing some more in-depth coverage on his channel, whether it's reviews or playthroughs, or just his general thoughts on the value proposition and if it's worth backing or getting at retail, or if it's worth backing at all. If any of that sounds helpful to you, I do have a link to his channel in the description below, but that's pretty much all I have for an intro, so let's check out the campaigns. And the first campaign we have launches on October 9th, and this one is called the Great Tea Robbery. And this one's going to be a little bit different than your typical board game. And if I were to compare it with some of the games already out there, I would say this one falls into more of those escape room style of games, because in this game you're going to be using the different items and clues that come along with the game in order to solve puzzles and riddles and try to discover the mystery on a tea-focused mystery adventure. And I know that sounds cozy and nice, but this game actually takes place back during the 1800s, and it does touch on some of the events that were going on at the time, like the Boston Tea Party, as well as smuggling and the Opium Wars that were happening during that time. But this is going to be roughly providing about 20 hours of gameplay as it takes players through those true events, and as the players solve different puzzles in order to move through the overall campaign. One thing that is really interesting about this one is that in combination with solving these different puzzles, the game is also going to be incorporating a lot of tactile and sensory elements with the components that it's bringing into the game. And with this one being a tea-focused mystery adventure, you can expect a lot of very interesting fragrances and plants and flowers that you would expect when you do have a nice cup of tea. And the last thing I want to mention on this one is that this is from a team that has delivered on these types of games before, so they do have some experience creating these games, and they have also already delivered on their previous campaigns. Beyond that, I haven't dove too deep on the reception of the game and what people think of the gameplay, but I'm sure you can go ahead and find reviews if this one is a game that you think you might be interested in, and I always do recommend doing that to be sure that you are pledging for a game that you will enjoy. Of course, there will be a ton more info on their campaign page, which you can find linked down below. And also launching on the 9th, we have an expansion for the game ERUNE, and this is going to be called the Light and Darkness expansion. If you're not familiar with this game, this is a game that can be played one versus many, but it can also be played fully cooperative as well, because it does use an accompanying app. And this is going to be taking players through an adventure as they go through different dungeons and fight against the evil forces. This is a game that I thought was launching a couple weeks ago, so I did already provide coverage for this one. I did think this looked like a really fun game, so if this does sound interesting to you, I'll go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now so you can check it out, but as always I do have the link to the campaign in the description below. And this new expansion is going to be called the Light and Darkness expansion, but if you're not familiar with the original game, this is an app-driven one versus many campaign game. The app's going to be doing most of your heavy lifting and keeping track of different events and decisions, but it also does allow the ability for the game to be played completely co-op if you don't want to have one person acting as the enemies. Something that's really neat about this game is that each player is going to be choosing their own individual characters, their unique skills and abilities, but then they're also going to be keeping track of all their stats and items on their own dry erase player board. The front of the board is going to allow you to give your character a name, but then also track your health, your mana, your different stats, and experience points that you're gaining throughout the game, as well as to write down any weapons or gear that you might have equipped and any items in your inventory. The back of the board also provides a few areas where you can keep track of your various quests that you're able to complete, as well as any skills or spells that you may have gained or mastered as you played throughout the game. Like I said, the game can be played entirely co-op if you do want to play the game that way, but there's also a bunch of other modes of play as well. And if you do want to play with one player acting as the enemy, they're going to be playing from behind a player board, but at the start of the game they also get to pick 2 skills that they'll be adding into their arsenal and they'll be able to take advantage of throughout the game. And that player is not only going to be controlling and activating the various monsters that appear throughout the game, but they're also going to be playing a little bit of Dungeon Master as they do control the dungeon and also reveal certain aspects of the game and the story to the character as it progresses. This means that they'll have additional information as to when certain events or traps could trigger, and they can use their monsters to try and push the other characters into those situations that benefit them. Before a round starts, the app's going to read out any special events that might trigger based on the current state of the game, but then you're going to be moving into the enemies phase where if you do have a player acting as the enemy, they're going to be activating their various monsters that are out on the board, moving and attacking according to those monsters' special abilities, but also intertwining those 2 abilities that they chose at the start of the game. But this player isn't only limited to performing actions during their turn, because they may also intervene during the player's turn, depending on if certain events trigger or if more of the dungeon is revealed, because it's up to the enemy player to handle all of that. But after the enemy's turn, each player is then going to get a chance to perform 2 actions on their turn, and each player is going to be performing movement with their movement die, which is starting as a 6-sided die, but then it can be upgraded throughout the game, which can potentially open up more movement points as the game goes on. Players are going to be using their actions to do things like prepare or engage in battle, and you're going to be rolling dice of different colors depending on the gear and weapons that you have, with some of these colored dice being more desirable than others. Depending on your character, you might also have access to various spells, and of course you're going to be spending mana in order to activate these. If the players are able to get a little bit of breathing room from the enemies, they can also use an action to search the room for various items, or to perform a rest action to heal some of their points or mana, and also potentially recover from some negative effects. The game continues like this, alternating between the players and the enemies, but there is also one more thing that I want to point out that I think is really, really cool, and that's that players can actually make a pact with the enemy, which will gain them a special ability card. These are usually pretty powerful and give you certain effects, but they also get triggered at certain situations that the players don't necessarily always control. Players will be trying to use this to their advantage, but once they fully utilize that card, it's going to be coming back to the enemy player with a special ability that's going to make that enemy more powerful. So there is a trade-off here, and the enemy player is going to want to be strategic when they do make these pacts. The new expansion is just going to be adding more of everything into the game, so you can just expect a lot more characters and enemies and dungeons and quests to discover. But they also did a lot more work on the narrative, making it a lot more rich and also introducing some new mechanisms along the way as well. If this sounds like something you'd like to check out, or if you already own the game and you want even more to experience, you can find a link to this campaign in the description below. And launching on October 10th, we have 2 new entries in the Dungeon Date series of games. And yes, there is only 1 game currently released, but they are adding 2 more, which now makes it a series. And these 2 new entries into this series of games are very different than the original, and they're very different from each other, but they do, of course, share a similar theme. If you're not familiar with the original game, this is a card game that played 1 to 4 players and takes about 20 to 45 minutes to play. And in this game, players would be using cards in order to build up their style and their outfit, pretty much represented by a bunch of different icons that are going to be shown on your different gear and clothing that you're able to equip. And then players would be going into the different dungeons and encountering different monsters that also have their own personalities, which are also represented by those same icons. Players will be able to interact with those monsters depending on how much overlap they have with their icons and the icons on the monster cards. This would then determine whether the player would be able to befriend those monsters, fight them, or even potentially fall madly in love. But whichever option it is, this did come with a set collection element, and players would be trying to set collect certain types of monsters in order to score the most victory points at the end of the game. The two new entries being introduced in this campaign are standalone games, but they can also be mixed in with the original game if you do want to incorporate elements and if you do already own that previous version. But this is going to be introducing both a roll and write as well as a role-playing game. I'll go over the role-playing game first, which is called Dungeon Date Delves, and this one's going to be providing a 1 to 2 hour role-playing experience. But at the start of the game, players are going to be each choosing a combination of creature and calling, which is going to set up some of their starting stats for the beginning of the game. But of course, players will be able to find new gear and style as they play through the game in order to change their personality and change the way that they might interact with some of the characters and creatures that they'll run into in the various dungeons. But of course, there is a goal and there is a narrative because this is a role-playing game. And in order to set all that up, you're going to be rolling a combination of dice at the start of the game. And then depending on the values that you roll for the various colored dice, you're going to be matching those up with a list of different possibilities and then combining those in order to set up the player's goals for the game and as well as kick off that general narrative. There are a bunch of illustrated dungeons that players will be able to explore, and in these dungeons, players are going to be discovering different monsters and characters, each with their own passions, hobbies, weaknesses, each of which may or may not synergize with your character's stats, which of course you can then use in your role-playing to determine if you want to fight that creature, befriend it, or even possibly take your relationship to the next level. As I said, this can be incorporated with the original game, and you'll be able to take the different monster and item cards from that game and then use them to visualize the accomplishments so far and the different gear and monsters that you have run into. And the other game being introduced in this campaign is the roll and write, which is called Dungeon Date Roll with Style. And in this game, players are each going to get their own sheet of paper, and you're going to be filling in different stats at the beginning of the game in order to determine your character's style. And then each round, players are going to be rolling a pool of dice, and then each player is going to be simultaneously choosing one of those dice to activate for their own player sheet, and the number is going to dictate the rooms that you can choose to visit, and then the color is going to determine the type of encounter you're going to have. There's different types of encounters that you could experience, whether that's running into different monsters or characters, or discovering different treasure that you can then use to change your personality and style, which can then be used to change the type of interactions you can have with those various monsters. Just like with the other games, your style is going to be determining what kind of interactions you can have with those monsters and whether you can befriend them or whether you can fight them. But players will be essentially getting different victory points for what they decide to do, but then players will also be able to fill in areas on their sheet for their different accomplishments, and players will be able to gain bonus victory points at the end of the game for filling in certain rows or columns or combinations of these different possibilities. Just like with the role-playing game, this one is also compatible with the original game, where you'll be able to use some of those original components in order to make this one have a bit more table presence. And if any of these sound interesting to you, you can check them out. I do have them linked in the description below. Also launching on October 10th, we have Davy Jones' Locker, The Curse of the Ghost Ships. And this plays 1 to 5 players and takes about 60 to 180 minutes to play. And this one is an expansion to their previously released game called The Kraken Wakes. And if you're not familiar with this game, this is a cooperative game where players essentially play over 2 acts. During the first act, players are going to be exploring the sea and the islands to try and gather gear and level up their crew and ships. And the whole reason for this is because during the second act, players are going to be going up against a final boss. Of course, the better that you've prepared yourself during the first act, the more likely you'll be able to fight against this Kraken. And this new expansion does play very similar to this, where it plays over 2 acts, but of course this one is introducing a brand new threat. The way the acts play also vary a little bit, with this one having a little bit more of a push your luck mechanism to it, because in this one players are going to be trying to spend that first act gathering up all the cursed gold and putting it back into the chest, which will then break the curse of the ghost ship and allow players to fight against that boss. The catch here is that the longer you take to do this, the stronger those ghost ships and the banshee leading them are going to be. So you do want to try and find that gear that you need as quickly as possible, so you're not making the first act too long, which would then make your final boss very powerful. Of course, this is going to be bringing all sorts of new enemies, equipment, crew members, and new ways to engage in battle. And if you are interested in this one, I do have it linked in the description below, but if you want even more information, I'll roll my previous footage for the previous game. And this is a cooperative game where players are each going to be choosing their own ship and crew at the start of the game, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, and then the game's actually played over 2 different acts. And during the first act, the player's goal is to try and upgrade their ship and crew as much as possible to get themselves in the best position for the second act. And in order to do that, players are going to be moving around the board, exploring different ports and markets, but then also battling raiding and naval ships and exploring different shipwrecks to gain gold, and then spending that gold to upgrade their ship and crew. But every action a player does have a chance of gaining more attention from the Kraken, and too much attention will wake the Kraken, triggering the second act, and this is where players will be fighting against the Kraken as well as its 8 tentacles, trying to work together to fight back in a sea of ever-changing whirlpools. And this game doesn't necessarily have elimination, because if there is a fallen ship, one of the other ships can go to try and rescue their crew, and the player of that crew will be able to perform some additional actions on their turn, gaining access to certain parts of that other player's ship. And if the players are able to defeat the Kraken and avoid their watery death, then they win the game. And this next campaign is not a board game, but it's something that you can use to upgrade your board games, because I'm sure most of us out there do have a train game in our collection. And this campaign is going to be offering you some deluxe train engines as well as railcars to go along with it. This one is a continuation on the set of train engines that they already offered in a previous campaign. This provided pretty much everything you need to deluxify your copy of Ticket to Ride or any other train game that you might have, because this offered 5 different types of train engines with very different colors and styles to really differentiate them out on the board. But like I said, this campaign is going to be introducing some new ideas as well, and my favorite of those ideas is that they are now going to be offering railcars. This means that if you are playing a game where you're going to have a bunch of different trains in a row, you don't have to just have a bunch of train engines. This is actually going to allow you to put actual railcars on the back of that train engine and make it look like a real train. And these are designed to pair with the trains that were offered in the previous campaign, offering you trains that match the style and color of those previous entries. And this final railcar is going to give players another reason to fight over red, because it also features a cute little cow sticking its head out of the window. If you're interested in this one, you'll definitely want to subscribe to get notified once it launches, because if you do back it within the first 48 hours, you'll also get a couple coins added to your pledge completely for free, which work really nice for both first player or active player tokens. As always, you can find a link to the campaign in the description below, and of course, you can click to get notified. Also launching on the 10th, we have an expansion for the game Moonstone, which plays 2 to 4 players and takes about 40 to 120 minutes to play. And this is called the Shades of Moonreach expansion. This is going to be adding another faction to the game, because if you're not familiar with this game, this is a fantasy skirmish game where players will be able to play as various factions, each with their own unique abilities and stats and skills. But essentially, players are trying to win this game by capturing the most Moonstones at the end of the 4th round. The way the game works is that players are going to be trying to capture Moonstones, which are represented by 4-sided die, and at the start of the game, you're just going to be dropping those onto the board, which causes them to be randomly positioned along with randomly decided values. But like I said, each player is going to be controlling their own faction of creatures, and players are going to be taking turns activating each of their creatures one at a time. In order to do this, players are going to be looking at their associated creatures card in order to see their stats, and then you're going to be spending the amount of energy that they have available to them in order to do different actions like move around on the board, attack an enemy, use a special ability or an arcane ability, or harvest a moonstone. And the way that you do that is by moving close enough to a moonstone so that the base of your miniature is touching it, and then for each time you perform that action, you're going to be reducing the value of that moonstone die by 1. Once it reaches 0, you'll be able to pick it up and add it to your own inventory. As you might have guessed, this is a tabletop skirmish game, so movement in this game is done by using a provided measuring stick, and there are varying levels of movement that can move you further than others, and the stick does have different dimensions to accommodate that. But a really cool thing about this game is that anytime you attack an enemy or use one of your arcane ability cards, you're actually drawing cards up to that specific attack stat or your arcane stat. This means that unlike a lot of tabletop skirmish games, those actual stats don't actually increase the amount of damage you do. Instead, they're just giving you more options, but they are also doing one other thing, and that's giving you information, because each of these decks of cards that you're drawing from are going to have a limited number of cards, and there's only 3 of each type of card in those decks. This means that if you're drawing more, you have a better idea of what is left in that deck and what your opponent might draw. This is really important because in combat, each player is going to be drawing these cards up to their stats and then choosing one to simultaneously reveal. But then the card that you pick is going to have a different outcome depending on the card of your opponent. So for example, if you were to draw maybe 5 cards and 3 of those cards are exactly the same, this means that you can be absolutely sure that your opponent doesn't have any of those cards because you have all 3 of them. This is really valuable information that you can then use to decide which card you want to play. There is also the possibility of chaining cards together to make your attack even more powerful, so that's another layer that you'll want to consider as well when it comes to the combat. But when it comes to using one of your arcane ability cards, the same sort of mechanism is used, but arcane abilities aren't necessarily used to damage opponents. They can have all sorts of different effects, and in this case, your opponent is just trying to stop you from being able to do that effect. And in order to do that, rather than worrying about how their cards will interact with yours, they just want to have enough information to try and guess what kind of card you picked. If they're correct, it will stop your ability. The game continues like this until the end of the 4 rounds, and the player with the most Moonstones wins the game. And if you are interested in this one, you can check it out. I'll have it linked in the description below. Also launching on the 10th, we have Cascadero, and this plays 2 to 4 players and takes about 45 minutes to play. And this one has a really impressive designer and a really impressive artist with Rainer Knizia and Ian O'Toole, who have both done fantastic work in the industry. And the game that they put together for you here today is a competitive one that features some elements of tile placement and then also some elements of abstract strategy. And the reason that this one is somewhat like tile placement is because you're not actually placing tiles in this game. Instead, on your turn, you're going to be placing one of your own colored tokens. And the whole goal here is to try and create groups of your tokens so that you're able to score them, because you can only score them once you do create a group. And the thing that triggers that scoring is any time that they end up being attached to an adjacent city. Cities are represented by these different colored hexes here, but the catch with the scoring is that each of your groups can only score for each of these cities a single time, which means that if you create a group of 2 tokens and connect it to a city, that's just going to be scoring you 2 points, and even if you add more of your units to that group, it's not going to be granting you any more points unless you're able to also connect that group to another city. Then that'll trigger scoring again because it's the first time you interacted with that city, and so on and so forth. So there is some strategy with timing when you actually connect your groups to the various cities. Another thing to note with scoring is that you do gain more points if that city has already been connected to other groups. So whether you've connected to them or your opponents, you are incentivized to try to connect to cities that have already been connected to. And of course, you are doing all of this to try and gain victory points, but mainly connecting to these different colored cities are going to be moving you up the associated track that matches the color of that city. Moving up these tracks also can gain you victory points, but it also can grant you various bonuses and special actions. This can grant you more flexibility out on the board, like scoring one of your groups twice, or placing an additional token, or even moving around some of the tokens on the board to different locations. Not only that, but there are also some shared objectives in the middle of the board, and some of these can only be scored by the first player to achieve them, while others are allowed to be scored continually throughout the game, and players will be trying to reach the requirements of those various objectives in order to gain those points. The game can end in one of 2 ways. Either a player has run out of tokens to place out on the board, or one of the players has reached 50 victory points. But having the most victory points doesn't necessarily win you the game, because there is one more thing I neglected to say, and that's that each player is going to be associated with one of the various colors, and you need to max out that specific color to be eligible to actually win the game, which means that each player is incentivized to score more points for a particular color. So it's not all about victory points, but players will be trying to manage those 2 objectives in order to make sure that they max out their own specific track, but then also try to get the most victory points. If this one sounds interesting to you, as always, I do have the link down below. And launching on October 11th, we have Flame and Fang, and this plays 1 to 4 players and takes about 30 to 60 minutes to play. And this one is a cooperative deck building campaign game that can also be played as one-off scenarios. But something that I really do like about this one is that it does provide a narrative, and there is going to be unique rules and changes depending on which chapter you're playing through. But these are all provided through cards, so you don't have a giant campaign booklet or anything like that. Everything is spoon-fed to the players through cards that players are going to be playing through for each of the chapters. The game does also provide quite a bit of variety, even if you do want to play the same scenarios or the campaign over again, because there is a configurable difficulty that you can play through, as well as a hexagonal board that can be randomized for each of the games. And there is a whole ton of different cards that you can use to build your deck, with a portion of them just being randomly drawn at any point throughout the game, and then other ones that are specific to the scenarios that you're playing. There's also a ton of different monsters and events that players can run into, with only a portion of them being used in a given scenario. But before I get too far ahead of myself, I do want to mention that this one is my own personal pick of the week, and I do have a few reasons for that. One of the main ones is that this is a game that's been designed to fit quite a lot in a very small package. I like this for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's just nice to only have the components that you absolutely need, but taking a design standpoint like this means that every detail of the game has been really well thought out in order to try and maximize the amount of fun with reducing the rules and component overhead, which also just makes the game a lot less fiddly. But one other very important detail that comes along with this that I think all of us can appreciate is that this is going to make the game much more affordable. And I will go more into the details of the game in a second here, but if this does end up sounding like one you might be interested in, I do highly recommend subscribing to this campaign and checking it out just to see the prices, because the affordability of this one is going to be one of the main selling factors. And another reason why this one is my pick of the week is because I do think it has quite a lot of interesting, unique ideas going for it. And I don't just mean this from like a gimmick standpoint where it's adding something new that may or may not be fun. What I mean here is that these look very interesting to me from a design standpoint. And an example of this is the way that the deck building works in this game, because in a lot of deck building games, you'll be wanting to trim down your deck as the game goes on. But I think that the way that this game does it is much better than the way 90% of deck building games handle this, because most deck building games create a very arduous process in order for you to try and remove cards from your deck. Usually it comes in the form of either gathering and paying resources in order to do this, or to use your actions in order to do this, or to put other cards into your deck that have an action on them that allow you to remove other cards from your deck when you draw those cards. And I do like variety in games, so I'm glad all of those other options do exist, but this one takes a very simple approach. Anytime you add a card to your deck, you simply get to remove one. This just removes that whole arduous process and just lets you focus on creating the deck that you want. And this also comes with a few other layers on top of it, and I think this game has enough other things going on that the removal of trying to manage your cards and try to trim down your deck is actually a very nice thing, because there's a ton of other things to focus on in this game that all seem like much more fun than that. But in this game, players are going to be playing as individual dragons working together to move through the campaign. The round structure alternates between the player's phase and the enemy phase, where each player is going to have a chance to activate their dragons, and then you're going to be moving to the enemy phase with each of the enemies getting an activation. Players are going to be using their deck to perform various actions like movement, attack, resource generation, or any other special abilities. There's a bunch of different resources that players can generate in this game, and they can be used for a variety of different things, like drawing additional cards into your hand, activating the boost action of a card to make it more powerful, because each of these cards does also have a secondary action that can be unlocked through resources. But then you can also use those resources to get an additional action on your turn, but this does come at a cost with you adding a negative effect card into your deck that will come out at some point, and you'll have to deal with the effect. But then normally it is discarded once it appears. But one thing you might have noticed is that each of the player boards has 3 different icons located on their player board, and this is because each of those icons is going to be associated with either your movement cards, your attack cards, or your resource generation cards. And the reason that this is depicted on the player boards is because each round you're only going to be able to choose one of these to be able to activate. This means that if you're drawing a lot of movement cards into your hand, you might want to perform the movement action, but that might not always be the case if you're in a sticky situation that's forcing you to fight. Another neat symptom of this is that it allows players to decide whether they want to create a more balanced deck, where they might be getting more diverse cards into their hand, but then they'll have more options on their turn, or if they want to specialize with just one or two of these specific card types, and then having a ton of cards in their hand for a single turn, but then being very limited to the type of actions that they can perform. But another really neat layer on top of this, and an aspect of the game that I absolutely love, is that whatever type of card you choose to be able to use on your turn, if you have any cards in your hand that are left of that type, you can actually put them to the side of your board in a reserve so that you can use them on a future turn. Or not, because you might want to do that just to get cards out of your deck and make your deck even more trim for the rest of that round. I really love games like this that give you powerful decisions like that, but usually at the cost of the other. But the cool mechanisms don't stop there, because I also really love the way that the damage works in this game and the way that you heal your character, because when you do take damage in this game, you're going to be taking one of these life cards and then adding it into your deck. Each of these life cards does also come with a specific type, and once that card comes back out, all you have to do is play that card in order to heal yourself and to be able to put that card back on your board. But because that card does have a type associated with it, that means that you have to choose that type that round in order to heal that health. This is just creating another great decision point, because players will be wanting to heal themselves, but if it's not the action type they want to perform at that specific moment, you're going to have another tough decision, which is going to create some really interesting moments in the game. But after all the players have played all the cards that they want to play, you're going to be moving into the action phase for the enemies, and you're going to be activating them based on the cards provided in that scenario deck. But enemies aren't only limited to actions during the enemy phase, because some enemies can have reactions that might come in effect depending on how the players interact with them or if they deal them damage. And there could also be some special events that occur that could cause them to get additional actions, because after the enemy's turn is up, you're going to be drawing an event card and then resolving the effects of that card. The game continues like this as players move through that scenario deck and following the narrative and the options that it has to offer. And then, of course, if players are playing through the campaign, you'll be moving into the following scenario until you reach the end and hopefully win the game. As always, I do have a link to this campaign in the description below, and like I said before, this is one that I do recommend following along with, because I think it's going to be offering you quite a lot of game for a very reasonable price. If you do like what you've seen so far, you probably don't need any more reasons to back this game, but I will give you just one more, because I think this is a really cool fact, and that's that this game is actually designed by the people running the One Stop Co-op Shop. If you're not familiar with this channel, this is a YouTube channel that has provided a ton of great coverage over the years. They do an amazing job, and they are completely self-funded by themselves as well as their community, so they don't take any money or anything from publishers. So I know supporting their campaign will mean a lot to them to make all their efforts just a little bit more sustainable. And what better way to show your support for a channel like this than to get an excellent game in return. And launching on October 12th, we have a new edition of the game Patrician, and this plays 2 to 5 players. It takes about 20 to 50 minutes to play. And this one is a competitive game where players are architects working in Italy in order to build the biggest towers throughout various cities. The main board features all these different cities, and each of the cities is going to have a number of towers that can be built there, as well as tokens that are randomly assigned at the start of the game that are going to dictate how tall the towers can be. Because on a player's turn, they're just going to be putting out one of their floors onto one of the towers in the various cities. And of course, the goal here is to try and contribute your tokens to the tallest towers, because the height of the tower is going to be indicating its victory points, and the player that has contributed the most to that tower is going to be the one that gets to earn them once that tower is scored. But you might have noticed that each of these locations also have a card face up beside them, and that's because anytime that you contribute to that location, you're going to be taking that card into your possession and then replacing it with a new one. These cards are really nice because they can either offer you set collection to score you additional victory points at the end of the game, but they can also grant you with additional actions or special abilities, which can allow you to do all sorts of different things, like add additional floors in a single turn, or even move some floors from one building to another. The game continues like this until no more floors can be placed, and then the player with the most victory points is going to be the one to win the game. But this new version of the game is also going to be introducing some new ideas into the game, offering a new rule set for 2-player mode that's going to be introducing an AI player that's going to be challenging the players. But then there's also going to be some optional modules that players can choose to include into their game to add even more variety in terms of scoring victory points. If this one sounds interesting to you, I'll have links to the campaign in the description below. And the next campaign we have launches on the 13th, and this one's called Assault Sicily 43, and this plays 2 to 4 players and takes about 60 to 180 minutes to play. And this one is a tactical war game that takes place during World War II. Of course, this one does take place in Italy, so this game is going to be focusing on that portion of the war, with players being able to play as Americans, Germans, or of course the Italians. Players will be able to play through these story elements of the game either as a one-shot scenario or as a complete campaign, and the game's going to be offering a ton of different map configurations and units that players will be able to deploy. Each unit in this game will have its own set of stats, and combat in this game is resolved using dice rolling. I don't normally dive quite as deep into these war games as I do with the regular board games, but if you are interested in knowing more about this, Zilla Blitz did already put out a video letting you know everything that he likes about the game. And you can go ahead and find that video on the campaign page right now, along with a ton of other information, which is always something I love to see. But if you do want to see any of this and learn more about the game, I do have it linked in the description below. And launching on the 15th, we have Boardquest Tales of Liria, and this is a fantasy campaign game that can be played both cooperatively or competitively, and this is also a campaign that I thought was launching a couple weeks ago, so I did already provide footage for this one, and I think I did a pretty good job, so I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now. And launching on September 9th, we have Boardquest Tales of Liria, and this will be offering both a board game as well as a digital video game. Each player is going to be controlling their own faction, which each has its own unique playstyle and deck of action cards associated with it, but each faction is also going to have its own hero, and you're going to be playing as this hero, and as you level up that hero and upgrade them, you'll be able to unlock new and stronger cards from your deck. There's a couple different ways that you can win the game. You can either eliminate all of your enemy heroes, or instead you can control a certain amount of forts. On a player's turn, they're going to be drawing a new card from their deck and adding it to their hand, and they're also going to be gaining gold, but then also spending gold depending on how many recruited units they currently have. They'll then be able to perform any number of actions like recruiting a unit, upgrading a unit, selling an item, buying an item, discarding a skill card, activating an ability, or moving or attacking an enemy in range. And there's a couple different enemies you can fight in this game. There's monsters that you can find out on the board, and if you're able to defeat them, you might get different stat upgrades or special effects. But you can also attack the other players. But the combat's the same whether you're attacking a monster or another player, and all you have to do to land your hit is have an attack power that's greater than their defense. The way that you calculate this is that you're going to be adding up your attack stats to any of the gear that you might have or any special effects. And then you're also going to be rolling 2 dice and then adding those values to your attack power. And then if your attack is larger than the defense, then you're going to be inflicting a certain amount of damage. This is great if you want to try and win the game by eliminating your enemies, but like I said, you can also conquer forts. And in order to control a fort, all you have to do is move onto a space that has a neutral fort, and then that fort will become yours. But the interesting thing about controlling a fort is that the unit that you use to claim that fort can no longer move, attack, cast any skill cards, or use any active abilities. But they do get a +2 to their defense, so they do have a little bit extra defense when it comes to defending. And that's everything I have for you this week, but of course this video just wouldn't be complete without a few extra giveaways tied onto the end here, and I do have quite a few to go over with you today. And of course, to enter these giveaways, you don't have to like or subscribe or do anything like that, so these are super easy to enter. All you gotta do is leave a comment down below, and then I'll randomly draw from those comments at the end of next week. And the first one we have is called Cretaceous Rails, and if you haven't checked out this game yet, this is a game that allows players to both manage their train and their railway, which they'll be using to branch out into the Cretaceous forest and take different tourists out to see the dinosaurs that they want to see. This of course will score you victory points, but your train can be used for a lot more than that, because players will be using an action board to decide what type of action they want to take, and you can actually use your train to go out into the forest and clear areas of the forest, or even to capture those dinosaurs and take them back into your own resort. And building out your resort will expand your options and scoring opportunities, but the game allows you to pretty much expand every element of this game. You'll be able to expand your train, as well as your railway, as well as your resort. All of these will be gaining you victory points in various ways, and of course it's the player with the most victory points at the end of the game that wins the game. This giveaway is going to be for the core game pledge, and like I said, all you got to do to enter this giveaway is leave a comment down below, and you can say anything that you want. Just make sure that you leave the hashtag dino in it, and if you are looking for a suggestion, maybe you could let us know what your favorite dinosaur is. For myself, I was pretty big into dinosaurs when I was a little kid, and it's probably the first thing that I ever geeked out on. And my childhood favorite was always the Dilophosaurus. I don't know why, I just thought it looked so cool and it reminded me of one of those frilled lizards. I don't know exactly how accurate Jurassic Park was with the way that they depicted this dinosaur, but the fact that it could throw out its gills and also just spit poison at whatever it wanted was probably one of the coolest things I could ever imagine as a 10-year-old. And it's still pretty cool. And the next giveaway is going to be for a pledge for Hello Kitty Day at the Park. And this is a tile placement game where each player is going to be playing as a different Hello Kitty character with their own unique ability. But players are essentially going to be scoring points through set collection, and there's a couple ways that you can do this. One is through the tile placement itself, because depending on the way that you place the tiles, you're going to be getting certain benefits for that. But then you'll also be able to move your characters around on the board, gaining any of the icons of the locations that you land on and using those for set collection and scoring at the end of the game. Set collection comes into play with the various cards that players will be able to gain throughout the game, trying to match the icons with the card with the icons you're collecting out on the various tiles. Of course, the player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins, and this giveaway is going to be for the afternoon outing pledge. And in order to enter this giveaway, all you gotta do is leave a comment down below, but just make sure to leave the hashtag kitty in it. And as always, you can leave any comment that you want, but if you're looking for something in particular, maybe we can go back to that age-old question of, are you a cat person or a dog person? Or maybe another type of pet person, because for myself, I'm definitely more of a plant person. They destroy my house quite a bit less, but still do demand a fair bit of attention. Although I do really like cats because I just think they're hilarious. And the next giveaway is going to be for a deck of the mini one deck game and scorecards. And these are pretty much your typical deck of cards, but they have a lot of different use cases. They are shaped in a square instead of your typical rectangle shape, which allows you to use them to play different games like chess or checkers. But of course, they can also just be used to play any card game with your typical deck of cards. They also have some values on them to allow them to be used as poker chips or even as a substitute for a roll of a die. Quite a lot of possibilities here in a very small deck, which of course makes this quite ideal for traveling. And as I said, this is going to get you one deck of the cards. And under this giveaway, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. This one's going to be run over on our Discord, and you can find a link to that in the description below. This one's still just as easy to enter as entering a comment, but instead all you gotta do is head over to the Discord from that link down below, and then head over to the giveaways channel, and then just click the emoji underneath that giveaway. That'll get you entered into the giveaway, which will be drawn automatically at the end of next week. But now let's go ahead and draw the winners for last week's giveaways, which were for a pledge for Theme Park Mania, the Tiny Game series, Gold Nugget, and Vynestra, which is a Rome-themed RPG. And two of these were run over on the Discord, so those will be automatically drawn. And I do post these videos a little bit before the giveaways on Discord from the previous week get drawn, which means that if you are watching this soon enough, you can enter these giveaways as well. So you might want to hurry up and check out the Discord and see if those ones still are running. For the other two games, we'll be using this comment picker to draw the winner, and all these extra names down here are bonus entries from my Patreon subscribers. If you do like this content, you want to help support the channel, I do really appreciate it. It does make a massive difference for me because I do offer all my coverage for free. I don't require publishers to send me any games or to pay me in any way. So if you are able to do so, it is an option, but of course just liking and subscribing and sharing these videos whatever way you can does make a big difference for me as well. So feel free to do all of those things. But for now, let's go ahead and draw one of those winners. And the first one we will be drawing for is for Theme Park Mania. So let's go ahead and draw those comments and draw a winner. And the winner is Tavanesh, which is one of our Patreon subscribers. I'll reach out to you and let you know that you won yourself a pledge for Theme Park Mania. But now let's go ahead and draw the winner for the Tiny Game series. So let's update that. Get the comments and draw the winner. And the winner is Stephen Killen, and this is another one of our Patreon subscribers, so I'll reach out to both of you and let you know of the pledges that you won. For everyone else, we do these every single week, and they are free to enter, so feel free to check back on any of my videos and even enter the giveaways for this video here today. And of course, you can also click that little bell icon underneath my video to get notified anytime I put one of these up, because it has lots of useful content, but then also those giveaways as well. And I only post one video per week right now, so you're not going to be getting spammed with a bunch of different videos that you might not be interested in. And that's it for this week, and for all my fellow Canadians out there, I want to wish you a very happy Thanksgiving weekend. It's always nice to have another long weekend, and this is absolutely one of my favorites just because it means a ton of good food and a ton of nice weather, because it's still warm enough but not quite as crazy hot as it is in our Canadian summers. For the rest of the world, I don't know exactly when or if you have Thanksgiving, but I'll just wish you all a fantastic weekend as well. And if you do have a Thanksgiving weekend coming up, or it already passed, I hope you also had a ton of great food. And you know what? Even if it's not Thanksgiving, I hope you all have a ton of great food. We need more food-related holidays. I want sushi. That's all I got this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. And as always, keep those plates covered and your belly full.
Oh.